our sermon series, our study series on passing on the faith. We're about halfway through now, and we are leaving the Old Testament behind for the first time. We had 4 lessons in the Old Testament, we got 4 on the New. And today we're going to be looking at one of the most famous stories in the New Testament, the calling of the disciples. And I got a picture there. We have lots of great art to show calling the disciples there. Of course, the call appears in all 4 Gospels, but in slightly different ways. The Gospel of John talks about how the disciples were introduced to Jesus by John the Baptist and how they encountered him and how he called them to follow them, although we don't know if they continue to follow him every day after that. Matthew and Mark have a very brief encounter. Jesus sort of walks by the places where they're fishing and calls them. Here in the Gospel of Luke that we're going to be looking at today, we see a fuller account of this. I guess you could argue that it makes more psychological sense in that they seem to have known Jesus before. They are going to hear his call, they're going to hear him sharing, and then they're going to act on that. So here's what we're going to hear today. It starts off in chapter 5, verse 1. One day, as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, the people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. And you're probably going, the lake of what? The lake of Gennesaret was a name for the Sea of Galilee. It has 3 different names that we find in the ancient world. It was also known as the Sea of Tiberias. This is the only place this appears in the Gospels. Gennesaret was a plain on one side of it, so it was the lake around the big plain, I guess you could say, was one name for this place. The Sea of Galilee, of course, is not really a sea, even though it has that name. It's a lake. And I've got some pictures here so I can talk about it here. Here's an aerial view of what the place looks like. It's 13 by 6 miles, 13 miles long, 6 miles wide. There you see the context of it. And you see that it's got that upper range where it has it, and then this is what it looks like today. And so it's a big, big lake, but it's not a sea, well, at least not by our definitions today. It's got hills pretty steep on one side, pretty flat on the other side, and it's warm. It is 680 feet below sea level, which surprises a lot of people. So that means that the water in the Jordan River and the water in the Sea of Galilee, because they don't let out to the ocean, actually contain much more. It's still fresh water. You could drink it, but you can't irrigate with it. If you irrigate with it, it will salinate the land and poison it over time, which is why they're so vulnerable to droughts and why today they have pioneered so many of the drip irrigation techniques, because they have to desalinate the water they're going to irrigate with, which, as you can imagine, is an expensive and difficult process. Okay, more than you probably wanted to know about the irrigation systems of Israel. So, crowds are gathering around. Jesus is by the Sea of Galilee. All these people are there, and they're pressing him in. And so where do you go there? Well, verse 2 tells us, he saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. So first of all, I want to tell you a little bit about the boats there. There's a famous boat that was dug out of the Sea of Galilee about 20, 30 years ago called the Jesus boat. That doesn't mean that Jesus was in it, but it's the time of Jesus. So that's where it gets its name. And they have a museum dedicated to it so that you can go and see it. And it is, I'll look at the dimensions, 26.5 feet long, 7.5 feet wide, 4.5 feet deep. And we think that's pretty much the pattern for boats in those days. So that means they're fairly long, decent size of width, small boats, but they're kind of shallow-sided, making them vulnerable to storms. But if you're working, this is a model based on it that you can see today, what it would have looked like by their guess. You can also purchase those online if you, no, I'm not so sorry. And they're washing their nets. Okay, why are they washing their nets? Well, they get filled with debris as they pull them in, and so they have to take those out to keep the nets, and they also mend them at the same time they're washing them, getting them all ready. So he sees these 2 boats there. He's going to go sit in the boat, so that'll keep the crowd at a safe distance, and he can talk to them and share with them. So verse 3 tells us, he got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon. Simon is, of course, the same person as Peter. Peter is his nickname, which means the rock. Simon is his actual name, okay? He's also known as Cephas because that's the Aramaic word for rock. And we don't know of anybody prior to this, or for a considerable time or after this, who was known by that nickname. It seems to have been very unusual for their day, whereas we do meet people that are named Rocky or Stony or other things, okay? In fact, we had one family here for a while that I think they had a Rocky, a Stony, and a Cliff on their same, all in their family, which, leaving that aside. Anyhow, he got in one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from shore. Presumably he knew the guy, otherwise it would be weird. Let me borrow your boat. I don't think most of us would do that unless you knew the guy. Maybe, but I assume there was a connection, and that backs up what we hear about in the Gospel of John, that they knew each other prior to this. And he asked him to put out a little from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. Now, the normal posture for teaching is to sit in the ancient world. Everybody else stood, but of course you're smart if you sit in a boat anyway. So Jesus is sitting there teaching. When he finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Presumably he's gotten out of the boat then and is having Simon back in it, but notice what he says to him. He says, "Go out to the deep water and let down the nets for a catch." And we have a picture here that I think might give you some idea of what this conversation might have looked like. Now, that's an interesting thing to say. Simon is a professional fisherman, and he is going to answer him with his response. Simon answered him, verse 5, "Master." Notice that title. We don't know at what point he decided Jesus was his master. Before this whole encounter? I don't know, but certainly now he's acknowledging him as the Lord or the one in charge of his life. "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything." Normal time for fishing was at night, all right? And they would fish at the part of the lake, we know they lived in Capernaum, which is a town just a little ways away. There was a place where most people would go fishing because there are 7 water sources that feed into it there, and there's extra food for the fish, so they gathered there. That's the normal place they would go, and we'll see pictures of that in a little bit later on in the service. But he says, "We worked hard all night and haven't caught anything, but because you say so, I will let down the nets." Notice that I'm the professional here. You probably don't know what you're doing, but I trust you because you're my master. I'm going to do what you say, and I'm going to obey it. Now, everybody was asking me this week all kinds of questions about fishing techniques and fish. So I have a little bit on this. So here we have a picture, I think it's of the fish that we can show you. The bottom's cut off, but it has the normal kinds of fish there are, first of all, catfish, which of course Jewish people can't eat, but I assume they caught and sold. I don't know that. They couldn't eat them because they don't have scales, and which is one of the requirements. Then they had carp. They have a flatfish, and I'm not going to tell you the technical name for it because it was kilade or something. I couldn't even say it. But that one you see there pictured is the St. Peter's fish, which if you ever go there, that's the one they always eat, the one that's, they serve it to you. It's about right for one person to eat at a meal. And then right below it, the one you can't barely see is the little fish that was very common there. It's just a smaller form of the panfish, and that's one. These were caught, shipped around the world. In fact, we have found them as far away as Britain. They were sold fresh locally, but they were also pickled, salted, dried, put in caskets, and sold and shipped all over the Roman Empire and used to feed the army. The fish meat was the number one meat that people ate in the around that region. So this was a staple food that we hear about frequently. And what kind of nets do they use to catch? I think our next picture shows those. If you look closely, you'll see there's a guy throwing in the right-hand corner. He's throwing a circular net, which you could then draw in. They had drag nets, but they didn't use them the way we would use drag nets. Instead, you see that on the left bottom. That's how they would do it. They would get it put out there and then drag it in, on the shore and get everything. And then the kind of net that boats typically used were called trammel nets, and they would go out there and kind of drive the fish into the nets, and they would go and get caught into this kind of funnel-shaped one. Anyhow, more than you need to know about that, too. But they're out there fishing away. He says, "Because you say so, I will let down the nets." So they go out to fish. When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. Now, I don't think that would be a very common occurrence. It's a miraculous abundance of fish that they have. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. And again, this amazing catch when they hadn't caught anything all night. So they're bringing this in. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." Now, I want to tell you that, first of all, he falls at his knees. The word that's used here is proskynesis. This is a word for going full flat on your face. It's not something that people typically did. How often have you done that? We don't even bow before people because that would be a normal sign of obedience and respect or vulnerability. But spreading yourself out was an act of worship. So they're really, when he's doing this, he's acknowledging something they wouldn't do, and that people, well, Alexander the Great, for instance, tried to get his soldiers to prostrate themselves before him, and they threatened revolt because they saw it as an act of worship that was inappropriate. Okay, so they drew the line there on this kind of behavior. So Simon Peter falls at his knees in a worshipful attitude, and he hears this. He says this, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." And we hear those words frequently. We think of especially maybe of Isaiah chapter 6, where Isaiah gets the call from God, and he says, "Lord, go away from me, for I am a sinful man, and I belong to a people of sinful lips." Well, here he's recognizing in the presence of God's holiness his own sinfulness, who he really is. And that's often the case, right? You sort of, I always tell folks I had a dog that we all thought was so white. People would come up to me and say, "Gee, this dog is so white." He was a husky Malamute. And then when it snowed and he would go out, you go, "No, he's not white. He's yellow." Because the snow's white, right? You see then in the face the contrast, and Jesus' holiness makes us aware of our sinfulness. So he says this, "For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken." I think it's a confirming sign to them of what they already knew. "And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners." So we hear not about Andrew, Peter's brother here, but about James and John working with him on the boats. Then Jesus said to Simon, here comes the call, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people." Now, we're used to hearing it with Matthew and Mark's words, "Come, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." But here, slightly different, "Don't be afraid." The Bible tells us 365 times, "Don't be afraid." People often say once for every day of the year. When we can encounter the holy, we're often afraid because we know we're unworthy. How do we react there? Don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people. Play on words, play on their occupation, but also this beautiful image of bringing people into the kingdom of God. And then it says this, verse 11, "So they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything, and followed him." A while back, we looked at Elisha, who was out plowing his fields, and when God called him, he burned his plow and used it to barbecue his oxen so that he could fully commit himself. Here they don't burn their boats, but they leave everything behind and immediately go to follow Christ, showing total commitment to Jesus and his cause. And we don't know what else, everybody was asking me too this week, what did they do with the boats? What happened to the fish? I don't know. They did something with them, but let's focus on the main part of the story here that we actually do know something about. It's always fun to speculate on these things, isn't it? Well, we'll get to another story about that. As I mentioned earlier, we have slightly different accounts in the different Gospels of this account. Here he doesn't say, "Come, follow me," but instead, but of course they do come and they do follow, so that's critical. By the way, I don't know if you noticed, but when you come into our building from the entrance by the coffee bar, if you look up right away, I'm always amazed because some people see this right away and other people could come into our church. Literally, somebody told me that they've been attending here for 3 years and they never noticed this. So if you come right in that door and you look up, we have an alcove there or a little ledge, and it always has some kind of art there. Right now, it's got a boat and 3 fisher, and Jesus and Peter and one other fisherman who are up there, and it says, "Come, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." So if you haven't seen that, look at it today or the next time you're coming into the building. Just look up a little bit, and you'll see that piece of art there. And it rotates. We get different things up there, but this one for this sermon series. Anyhow, here Jesus says, and we have here again the words that he said up there, on a picture of that. It says, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be fishers of men." I got to tell you, I've always heard this. I think the correct way of bringing people into the kingdom of God is a beautiful thing. But once again, this week, I was surprised to hear how somebody else took it in a totally different way and surprised me. They said, well, that sounds so terrible, like we're going out and trapping people and ensnaring them in nets and forcing them to come into church. And I was going, well, I don't think that's what it meant. I think it's more of a nice image of bringing them in. And a lot of you are laughing. I'll tell you another one. You know, when we were United Methodists, the symbol of the United Methodist Church is this cross and flame, which I love. And I guess worldwide, it's one of the top 10 logos in the world in terms of recognition and how people like it. Interesting to think of. But I remember somebody came to me, cross and flame, and they said, tell me about your church's connection with the KKK. And I was going, what? Because they thought it was a cross on fire, a burning cross, right? And most of you are going, really? Never would have seen it. Anyhow, catching men. I don't think it means snaring them or trapping them. It means this beautiful image. Well, what do we learn from this story? Well, you know, I think the first thing we learn from this story, and we got a picture again just to show you some different art of this story. The first thing is the fishermen themselves are caught, you know. We don't know how well they knew Jesus before, but here they definitely make a commitment to Christ and his cause. And here, they're going about their tasks. They're doing their daily jobs. They're working. And it's interesting to think they've been working all night without success. They must be tired. They must be disappointed, maybe angry or frustrated. The people in the ancient world lived hand to mouth. So here they don't have enough maybe even for their families for the day. But they not only allow Jesus to work, but they listen to what he has to say. And when Jesus tells them to go back out and to start their tasks again, they do it. I don't know about you, but I love it when people tell me what to do, especially when it's an area where I know something about it and they don't. Happened just this last week. I was talking to somebody and they were giving me extensive lessons on how to cook turkey tetrazzini. And if you know me, I'm probably not somebody you have to give a lesson on how to cook. Just saying. It was a 15-minute lecture on how to cook, and I was just going, nodding my head and going, okay, and they don't know what they're doing or saying. But you know how it is. Here it is. Jesus is saying it, and what is his response? Master, and because you say it, I'm going to do it. And we all know people that we just trust. We hear their words, and we go, seems crazy, but I'm going to do it because you're telling me to do this. I'm going to follow up on it. Master, we worked hard all night and haven't caught anything, but because you say so, I will let down the nets. Humble and obedient. And it's a little thing, I guess, that's going to lead to a big thing because they're going out fishing, and that's just, you know, it's extra work, it's something, but then they're going to commit their whole lives. So in little things and big things, we see the disciples making commitments, and I think that's an important thing to hear. And then this miracle happens. They catch this amazing amount of fish, and even though it's at the wrong time, all these fish are coming in. And we were talking this week, and somebody said, well, did they believe because of the miracle? I don't think so. I mean, they've already said master, they've already been humble, they're already showing obedience, but it certainly confirms for them. And that's one of the things that we as believers encounter. You know, I get asked sometimes, have you ever seen a miracle? Well, what would you say to that? I would say yes. I think of times when we prayed for healing and healing take place. I know one time I really damaged my ankle, and we had a lady in our church at that time who would pray over people. She'd say, well, you know, I think I have the gift of healing, but I'm certainly, it's from God, and sometimes it could happen, could not. It's up to God. She prayed over me, and my ankle was so much better the next week. They had told me I'd never run again, and you know me, I run all the time. But I would say, you know, the most amazing miracle I ever saw was we had our church in D.C. Had two boys that had been adopted from Cambodia. They had literally been thrown on the plane before Pol Pot came along, and their parents threw them on the plane. They weren't room for the parents to get on. They were university professors and presumed to be dead, and these two boys were taken in and adopted by a British couple who then moved to the United States to work in Washington, D.C., and they were attending our church, and there was a call to take on refugees from Cambodia, and because we had these two boys, we said, sure, and guess who we got? Their parents, who had had pretended to be uneducated for the entire time, even though they'd been college professors, and managed to survive. Now, you could say all those things, healings and others, coincidences, okay. But I think as believers, we see confirmation of our faith and that God's at work in our world and in our lives. And we see it in little things too. We believe that miracles can and do take place, and they're confirming. But they hear Jesus' words, they obey, and then they leave everything behind. They make commitment. The disciples commit themselves to witness by their words, by their actions, and their lives. And we hear about them sharing the gospel later on. We see in things that they're doing their commitment to follow Jesus Christ, and really it's their whole lives and their whole witness. Yes, on Friday I was in the prison. We were doing a retreat with the men there. And I was talking with one of the groups of guys there about faith and about examples that we'd seen of faith. And one of the guys was asking me about my parents, and he said, how did you know that their faith was real, or was it real? And I said, well, I got to see them, doing things all the time. They'd read their Bible, they'd insist we pray. But as I was thinking about that, what was the big thing that convinced me their faith was real? Looking back, was when they did something wrong, like if my dad lost his temper, or my mom was, nitpicky with us, they'd come and apologize to the little kids. I've got a problem with that. I'm trying to do better. I'll work on this. You see people trying to implement their faith in their lives. So it's the big things we do, like commitment to follow Jesus, like they did, leaving everything behind, but it's also the little things that really matter as well, because they shape and reveal. In little things and small, they were doing it. And that's why I say their lives really demonstrated their faith. And we all know people, we see them in our church and elsewhere, people who are really demonstrating Christ-filled lives. Not perfection. Certainly the disciples were not perfect people either. When we read through their stories, it's kind of shocking how they're portrayed, warts and all. And we wonder, about what kind of people they were, and why Jesus chose them. And he chose them. In the ancient world, typically, I think universally, disciples would go to their master and say, take me on as your disciple. That's not what we see in the Gospels. Jesus calls them. And that always makes us wonder, why them? Why did Jesus call these people? It doesn't seem to be because of any special thing about them. They don't seem especially smart or intelligent, well-educated. Their backgrounds seem to be all over the place. Their social status isn't anything. They don't seem to have a ton of money, at least most of them. And their character, why does Jesus call them? But then we wonder why Jesus calls you and me, right? And of course, the Jewish people, God's chosen people, there's a prayer that they say, typically in the morning time, where it goes, why the Jews? Why us? Why are we the chosen ones? So we don't know why he called the disciples, why he called the Jews, why he calls us to be his disciples. John Wesley sort of said, I don't know if you knew this, but this is actually one of the things that he said that has become kind of universal in the church. There was an idea before him that really those who were in the church were really meant to be in the church. You didn't almost need to evangelize because God had a plan, and those who were saved were going to be saved, period. And Wesley sort of said, no, God calls not just certain people, but he calls everyone. And it's sort of like salvation is like a gift or a present that's offered you, and there it is in front of you, and you have to choose to open that present, that gift of grace, to receive it into your life. And that's the great opportunity you have. Well, that's a Wesleyan idea, of accepting that, but that I think has become pretty much universally accepted now. And I'm going to share, there's another part to this story that I think is really interesting, because in the New Testament, there's two stories about miraculous catches of fish. This first one, when Peter is called to ministry, and the second one is where? Anybody know? Pop quiz. After the resurrection, John chapter 21. I saw several people with their hands up and knowing the answers, so congratulations. No, we have an extra cookie during the coffee time. What happens there in that story? You remember Peter has denied Jesus 3 times. Jesus has risen, but the disciples are seemingly at a loss for what they're supposed to do next. Is this just an experience for us? What's going to happen? And Peter and some of the disciples go back to their way of working, their lives beforehand. And they're back working and fishing. And they fish all night, and catch nothing, right? And that's what we're going to look at just real briefly, this story as it appears in John chapter 21. This is what it says. Afterward, Jesus again appeared to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee, and it happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus. Thomas means twin, so does Didymus. It's the Aramaic and the Greek words for that. I don't know anybody, do you know anybody named Twin? Hey, Twin. Anyhow, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, that's James and John, and two other disciples were together. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them, and they said, we'll go with you. So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. He said, throw your nets on the right side of the boat and you will find some. So just flip it over, you get your pole on the wrong side, put it on the other side, and you're going, okay. When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Okay, and we got some art there. Artists really love this. There it shows, can you show the next picture? Yeah, there you go. That kind of gives you an idea of the vast number of fish that are there. Yeah, some beautiful art there. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved, I like that, John always writes of himself that way. The disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. And Peter knows this. As soon as Peter heard him say it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off and jumped into the water. I love that part. In other words, it was hot during the night and they were doing heavy physical work, so typically they would strip down to wearing only their little loincloth and work. And now, when he sees that it's Jesus, he puts on his clothes and jumps into the water, right? That's what he does because he's so excited to see Jesus. And the other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish. Okay, so we hear that story there about this. And I share that story because it really reminds me that Peter, was called by Jesus, and he was called again by Jesus, and this miraculous catch of fish. A reminder, I think, of initial call and saying, I need you again to be with me. I've come to call you again. I'm not letting you go. My grace is there for you. And one other thing I want to lift up about this story. We have a sign downstairs in our church that reads, God does not call the equipped, he equips the called. We got a picture of that, I think. You've heard that, right? I always struggle with that a little bit because I wonder, there's some people in the Bible who are really called, and they are certainly equipped. I think of Moses, who is uniquely equipped to lead people in the desert, right? Because he was a shepherd for 40 years, and he grew up in Pharaoh's court, and he knows how to be a leader and a ruler. I think of the Apostle Paul, who spent years studying as a Pharisee, so he was the perfect person to help call the Gentiles into the Christian faith and to teach them about the origins and the roots of Judaism. But then you look at the disciples. Wow, did they have any qualifications at all? God is certainly calling them, even though they don't seem to be equipped at all. So I think God calls the equipped and equips the calls. It's some of both. We recognize that. By the way, somebody came to me this week and said, I know we're starting our look for a new pastor. What does the Bible tell us about that? And if you know me, then my brain immediately starts thinking through all the things the Bible might say about that. And of course, what story did I think of? Acts chapter 1, where the apostles meet and they go, well, we're missing an apostle because of Judas. He's left, so we need to call one. And how did they call him? By drawing lots, right? And I thought, that's what we should do. That's biblical. We should call the next pastor by drawing lots. We'll just get in all the candidates, and then we'll put their names in a hat and draw one out. And I thought, I don't think that's a good method. Anyhow, we're looking for somebody who might be a little more equipped, too, along the way, rather than just somebody at random. But I was thinking about calling the equipped or equipping the called, and it reminded me of another story that takes place at the same place where where this story takes place. I don't know if you knew this, but Tagba is the location where they typically fish because of all the water coming in. It's also the traditional and probably the correct site where the feeding of the 5,000 took place, right? And if you ever go there, remember the story of the feeding of the 5,000? Jesus is teaching all day long to these people, and then someone says, well, we should send them home, Jesus, because they need to get out of here because we don't have anything for them. And he says, why don't you feed them? And they say, we don't have anything. And he says, you don't have anything? And they say, well, there's a little boy here. He's got 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Okay, and Jesus says, bring them to me. And then he gives thanks and he starts passing them out, and it's the multiplication of the loaves and fishes until there's enough for everyone. Not only enough, but they gather in 12 baskets of food. It's the only miracle story that appears in all 4 Gospels. That's just interesting. And there's a church there built in this site today. I got a picture of that church. Okay, this is what it looks like. And if you look, you see those rocks that are there? That's where the Sea of Galilee has gone down a little bit. It used to be there that they would moor their boats. We can tell that because there's some big hooks there for them to latch their boats onto. That's why we know this is the spot where they were fishing. And then the inside of this church is one of the most ancient pieces of art in the world. Christian art, I should say. And I show it up close there. It's got the loaves and the fishes there. It's a mosaic thing. And I was there in 2000. They were restoring it. And I got the plates that we often use for communion. And this is what's on the plate. The same picture you're looking at here. I'd like to leave that for just a minute, if we could, that picture. Leave it up for a minute if you don't mind, because I want you to see there's 2 fish there, 1, 2. And then how many loaves of bread are there? 4. And so I bought these plates, got back here, and then I was going, what the hey? Did the artist not know the story? Did he make a mistake? It seems like a silly thing to do, right? And of course, when people ask me, I always say, well, it's at the bottom holding up the other 4, But what would you say? So I went back again to Israel with our church group a number of years ago, and I asked this question. I said to the tour guide, hey, what's going on here? Why are these there? And if you remember that picture we had just before that, he says, where is this mosaic? It's right in front of the altar. You see the altar there, the table in the background? He says that's where the minister stands, or the priest stands, when they're taking communion, because it's there that he's handing it out. And he said, what the artist is trying to say, well, he said, well, what do you think the artist is trying to say? He asked me that. And I said, well, duh. The artist is saying that the miracle's still on. That we still bring Jesus what little we have, and he's still multiplying our gifts. So it's not about him equipping the called or calling the equipped. It's about what we bring to Jesus and trusting that he's going to, in his power, use it to bless those around us, right? We don't have that much, but we bring it to the Lord, and it is magnified and multiplied and used for his work. That's a powerful thing to know, right? We're going to be celebrating the sacrament of Holy Communion in just a minute. Christ